What are my preferred hypertrophy method for athletes focused on the general preparation phase? So I've answered this quite a few times within these coffees with Steph, but with an athlete in the GPP, depending on the length of the off season, if it's shorter, if it's most North American sports where we're talking about 12, 16 weeks, I would not use advanced or bodybuilding type hypertrophy method in the GPP. It's too far away from sports performance on a neural perspective to be really useful with these athletes. So you focus on one, the nutrition aspect, obviously, but training wise, all you do is you use standard strength training, but at intensities that are relevant to hypertrophy on a strength quality perspective. So you might want to have your A series closer, like all the way down to that 70% of 1RM. You could do that. So that to me would be a little bit more useful for the athlete than to start implementing trisets and giant sets and stuff like that, which I love for hypertrophy. I just don't think it's the most relevant method or type of methods for the athlete. So I just want to be clear with most athletes off season, even if it's the GPP, if I want them to focus on increasing hypertrophy, the average intensity will just be a little bit less. So we're part of the hypertrophy strength quality. But then in terms of method at certain time points, so let's say the first intensification, now I might introduce an eccentric method, which will be beneficial for hypertrophy, but also has a lot of upside on future strength development. So that's how you have to look at it. It's like whatever you use, it has to be relevant to the performance of the athlete, which will always be more on the power end of the continuum as you get closer to the season. Okay, so to me, athletes, for the most part, forget about bodybuilding classic hypertrophy methods. Keep this for your gen pop, your physique athletes, or a athlete that has a very long off season in which you can afford to veer far away from the neural aspect of training because you'll have enough time to counteract these training effects. So what is the difference between top range, mid-range, and bottom range with the inertia method? It's hard to explain further than what the name describes, but if you're doing an inertia from the top range, it simply means you're overloading the top range. If you're doing an inertia method from the mid-range, you're overloading from the mid-range and up. And if you're doing inertia from the bottom range, you're overloading from the bottom range and up. So what it means is if we're doing this on a squat or on a bench press, knowing that both exercises have a ascending strength curve, which means that you're weaker in the bottom, and as you're going up and up and up, the lift becomes easier and easier. Well, then, if you want to overload the strongest point of the movement, which is the top part, well, then you could decide to do an inertia method top range. So this way, the bottom range of the squat, which is your limiting factor in terms of load selection, won't affect negatively your ability to overload that top range, which is strongest. So you can actually use the load that top range is able to withstand and just strengthen that part of the movement, which typically speaking gets undertrained when you're doing regular reps because that part is always limited by the weight you're using in the bottom. Now, if you want to overload the bottom range, then basically what you're doing is you're trying to strengthen the weakest link in your concentric range, which might be a great opportunity to break a strength plateau. So if, for example, your bench has been dormant at a certain weight forever and you want to break through that, well, we know that the limiting part will be from your chest up. So this way you can do an inertia from the chest, which forces you to engage everything and create as much force as you can in that part of the movement where you're the weakest. So as you get better at this, then it can allow you to break through a strength plateau in the future because now you've strengthened that limiting part. So, as the name says, it's just a question of where do you want to put the emphasis in terms of overload. So, if you have an athlete, you're getting closer to the season, and you know that your lineman in American football has to exert forces more at end range with their elbows, well, then you could do a phase with like top range inertia press, because now you're truly overloading the range that the athlete is using in its sport. So now you're strengthening that part at the expense of limiting the output that part of the movement can do by simply using standard reps where the limiting factor is the bottom. So these are the benefits of using different points of overload using the inertia method. During which training period do I suggest using post activation potentiation training protocols, and how do I use it? So PAP to me would only make sense to be used first of all in the specific preparation phase. It works very well with power development. You have to have attained a certain level of training age to be able to use these methods with benefits. At least intermediate, but mostly advanced. And then there's different levels of post-activation potentiation method, like a classic wave, like 532, 532, for example. This would be like the first exposure to PAP. Okay, so like those classic wave are kind of like your first exposure. Then you have a little bit more advanced contrast type methods like the 1-6-1-6-1-6, where this would come in later because it's a little bit more advanced in terms of potentiating because of the more drastic variations in load from set to set. You can also create post-activation potentiation using complex training and or contrast training as well. Again, these are just layers or even more complex training protocols to make use of PAP. So this, I would mostly use this in the last phase or maybe last two phases before the season, using like I said, waves, contrast methods, complex methods. The goal here is very useful, mostly on a velocity perspective. And but the reality, I just want to clarify this though. If you look at the first, the goal of PAP, basically, like a warm-up can kind of serve as a PAP. If you warm up all the way up to about 78-80% of your 1RM, and then you do a set, you'll have a potentiating effect. Okay, so it's about doing something that's going to wake up the nervous system, if you want, to potentiate better performance after. That's why I'm saying that there's kind of like a range on how you can use PAP. Like 753, 753 can create a post-activation potentiation effect. Now, obviously, because the average intensity of that one is a little less than 321, 321, or a contrast training or whatever it might be, maybe the effect won't be as big, but just understand that it's all about scaling when it comes to PAP, and it's a progression. But use them in the last two phases of SPP, and that's where it has the most bearing. So can I explain the difference between the power and the capacity of an energy system? So each energy system, that it's the anaerobic alactic, anaerobic lactic, or aerobic system, each system, you can train the power, so the intensity of that system if you want. And then you can also train the capacity or the volume of that system. So when you're training the power of a system, it's basically like you're training the system to become more and more and more intense, or stronger and stronger and stronger, more powerful. Okay, so you're increasing the wattage potential of that system. Now, once you've increased that, and then you decide to train the capacity, which should be done in that specific order, by the way, now you've created new power to that system. Now you're training the capacity, so it's your ability to recreate that new power for repeated effort. So your capacity to train at a higher power output. So that's why both modalities of energy systems needs to be trained. Okay, so I'm just gonna repeat here. At first, you train the energy system to become more powerful. Once that system is more powerful, then and only then can you train that system to be more resilient. So you can improve your capacity to work and tolerate and recreate that higher power output. So what steps should be put in place before starting 2-a-day training? Listen, so to me, 2-a-day training, it's something that you use sparingly to overemphasize something, or you use it like it's basically a concentrated block where like you're putting a ton more effort into trying to accomplish something. But every time you concentrate so much effort into a training block, you have to understand that it's short-lived. It's not something you should do for the long run. So before you do that, make sure that you have a good base of training. So make sure you've been training once a day for a while, you've had results, you've built something, and now you're at a phase where you're kind of approaching a plateau, or you're in a plateau, but at the same time, your drive, energy, mood is great. It's off the chart. If that's the case, then you can milk that point in time in your training into trying to get more out of this. So this is when, and only when, you should maybe think about implementing a 2-a-day block. So you could, let's say you build a 12-week macro, and I have an article on this on my website where I lay out the 1 year of 2-a-day training, so you can go and look on kilostrengthsociety.com into the article section. But what you could do is, okay, now I've hit a plateau, but my client is doing well, has been training hard once a week, but his energy is great, his mood is great, he's ready to go. Now what you do is both accumulation phases, you could do 2-a-days, which kind of makes sense for the structure of the program, because what is accumulation? It's the accumulation of training volume. You're trying to improve or to train or to increase the trainability of your tolerance to volume. So you could do 2-a-days to really, really push the envelope to the point of overreaching. And then as you're moving on to the intensification, you back off of the volume, revert back to once a day, and you really push the load. And then you come back to accumulation 2, you go back to 2 times a day. And then intensification 2, you come back down to 1 times a day. But that's it. So at the end of that 12-week block, then the next 12-week block, I would revert to a once a day only phase. Like very few people are going to be able to make constant progress for an extended period of time doing 2-a-day. So it's about a concentration of work to the point of quasi overreaching, not overtraining, but overreaching to facilitate the supercompensation effect that you will see during those intensification phases. But again, in order to be able to do that successfully, you need to have decent background prior of just standard training to the point where you've almost plateaued. Because if you're coming off, because a lot of mistakes that people do, because I see it all the time, people tend to do 2-a-day training not when their training is doing well. They tend to do 2-a-day training when they're coming off of, let's say, a month or 6 weeks of no training. Let's say they went on a trip, it's the holidays in the US, like from Thanksgiving to New Year's, they haven't done anything, and now it's January 2nd and they're freaking out. Now they're like, okay, I need to get back into it, and they start right away with 2-a-days. I mean, this is completely pointless, because at this point in time, there was no need to do 2-a-days. You would have had results with one a day. And then once you're consistent at 1 a day, and now you feel, okay, now I need to step it up, then you go to 2-a-days. But if you go straight to 2-a-days, then you have nothing to work with once you do plateau.